healing of the body. Come heal.
So last week, I focused on the theme of holy vessels, that part of our sermon series title. And I reflected on how we as a society and as individuals, we struggle with what to do with our imperfections, our brokenness. Right? We're so afraid of them that our pain turns to shame, and we begin to believe that we and others are fundamentally broken. We might even begin to hate ourselves, or at least those parts of ourselves or others, whether they are our curves or our hair or our general failure to measure up. Basically, we wish we could get rid of those parts of ourselves, throw them away like a broken bowl, and replace them with that version that our society tells us is good or beautiful or desirable. But what we find in Scripture is that rather than running from brokenness, we are invited to bring it all to God. What we find when we do is that God is not ashamed, no matter how rough or jagged our edges may be. See, the broken vessel that we are, which our world would throw away, God declares holy. Not in spite of our cracks, but rather knowing them full well. Because this is where God's healing light longs to break in, longs to seep in if we'll let it, to make us whole, not by eliminating our wounds or imperfections, our brokenness, but by illuminating them as that constant reminder of God's love for us, and that these cracks, these jagged edges, don't make us any less whole or valuable. We focused there, we started there because it's only when we can embrace this truth for ourselves that we are then able to extend that same healing love to others, rather than what we oftentimes do, which is take out our pain or fear, our anxieties on others. Because that is the other side of this morning's scripture, the invitation and challenge that I want to focus on this morning as we return to that gospel text from Matthew. As we see in 2 Samuel itself, the depiction of the blind and the lame as agents fighting against that most revered Israelite King David, well, it comes to serve as a justification for their exclusion from the Jerusalem temple, from God's holy sanctuary, for, quote, David hates them, as it goes on to justify in the scripture text itself. That's why we don't let them here. And so in time, this scripture would lend itself as a sort of bully club to the further stigmatization and exclusion of the blind and the lame from Israelite society as a whole. Scripture says it, so I believe it, people might have said. We're just following the Bible. It says it right there. I can point to the verse. So the blind and lame, along with others like those with leprosy, as we see in our reading from the Gospel of Matthew, this wide category of skin conditions, were not merely declared unclean or profane, but rather the effect of this categorization, this stigma, was that they were then kicked out of their homes and towns, that they were literally forced to live on the margins of society. They were thrown out like a broken bowl, cut off from human touch, from the possibility of love and relationships. Indeed, anyone who dare associate with such people would likewise be understood as contracting their disease, which meant that they too were now unclean, and the same stigmas, the same realities would thus apply to them. As such, the very bodies of those like this man with leprosy who approaches Jesus, their very bodies were seen by others as symbols of death as cut off from God, as good as dead. Now, after last Sunday's sermon, one of you asked a good clarifying question, something like, well, if we give these ancient pre-modern medicine folks the benefit of the doubt, might there have actually been a legitimate medical reason or concern for this practice of separation? I mean, for instance, there may well have been good reason for some of the food laws in the Old Testament, right? Declaring what people are and aren't allowed to eat, how they should and should not prepare it. It may have become communal law as a way of institutionalizing sort of best hygienic practices, right? Like akin to FDA regulations that function to keep you from getting E. coli and so on. Might such exclusionary practices have been akin to that? And especially after the year that we've had, we can appreciate and empathize with fears about the spread of this disease and wanting to protect the herd by isolating those infected. So I get it. It's a good question. The short answer, at least with what we see happening in our gospel reading and the practice that was widespread in Jesus' time, is no. Not really. You see, this exclusion was not primarily a function of medical understanding per se, but rather in a chaotic and uncertain world, religious and political leaders took that collective anxiety around feeling vulnerable to a variety of perceived threats from outsiders, from others, from foreigners, those whom King David must vanquish and conquer. These perceived threats to the social body are then taken and projected onto those bodies that, culturally speaking, were already seen as deficient, as less than. They're sort of scapegoated in that sense. And so what we see taking place around Jesus is people using their anxieties to justify a practice of exclusion. That is, we see the institutionalization of cultural prejudice. While anxiety is very natural and understandable, using our fears to justify excluding and marginalizing others is not. See, those who were in power didn't exclude the man with leprosy in our gospel reading because they thought that his leprosy would literally spread to others, because a little trial and error would be enough to show that that's not how it works, right? I mean, Jesus himself touches him. But rather, their religious prejudice, taken from Scripture itself, taken from history, like our second reading from 2 Samuel, and then combined with their cultural prejudices, their stigmas and stereotypes, all of those things combined together to see this man's leprosy and all those who had these skin conditions as a sign of cursedness, of rejection by God that required social exclusion. That is, such people were seen as having sinned against God, and therefore God had rejected them. That's what this thing on their skin is, God rejecting them. And so they, as people of God who are pure and holy, they must reject such people too. And in order to make that cosmic rejection clear, they institutionalize it throughout society. That is, everyone deemed unclean or defective must be excluded. Now, these weren't all necessarily laws that were enshrined that you could just sort of look up, like, no speeding over this limit, right? They were sort of the unspoken laws governing the world. And so the matrix of this morning's gospel story is a world where the religious leaders were oftentimes also the political leaders, that there's an unholy alliance here in a sense. And in order to establish order in their society, a sense of control in a world that feels out of control, well, they develop rules that both explain one's position in life and keeps them in their place. And so in that world, a man with leprosy who is declared unclean and pushed to the margins, a repulsive abomination, a man who is seen as cut off from God, a man who was as good as dead, approaches Jesus. And with fear and trembling, he bows down before him, and with a quivering lip, uncertain of how Jesus will respond, he stammers out, "Lord, if you choose, you could make me clean." Now, Jesus must have gained some sort of reputation, because this man was taking a huge risk by even daring to approach not just someone who is clean, but a holy man at that. Such religious leaders were precisely the ones responsible for justifying his exclusion in the first place. And so what will Jesus do? What does Jesus do? He stretches out his hand, Scripture says, and he touches him, saying, "I do choose. Be made clean." Now, whatever it was that physically happened to this man's body on that day, this story of healing is included in Scripture not merely because Jesus did some magic trick and we're like, "Whoa, Jesus, you do magic tricks." Rather, as we will see in the coming weeks, such stories are included so that they will be told and retold to make clear how Jesus defiantly confronts and transcends any social boundary that our world would establish that effectively marks some as less than, or as cursed, or as abominations. The effect of Jesus' words, "Be made clean," was the undoing of structures of exclusion and the cultural and religious prejudices that justified them. However one explains what happened to that man on that day, the effect is that one who once was socially dead has now been resurrected, has been raised to new life. You see, where our world would exclude, Jesus embraces. Those whom our society deems unclean or an abomination, those whose exclusion gets justified with Scripture, those whose bodily limits or so-called disabilities are met with derision or repulsion or disgust, such people, Jesus declares favored. Your body is not a symbol of death or cursedness, he is saying. You are God's beloved. Be raised to new life. That is, you are not what the world has tried to reduce you to, Jesus is saying. Be restored to community, to relationships, to a network of love and support, and go. Show yourself to those religious leaders in the temple. You know, that place where people like you have not been allowed. Go and show them how you bear the marks of God's presence. Child, be raised to new life. The Gospel of Matthew caps it all off, emphasizes all of this by finishing the story with a brief quoting of the prophet Isaiah, who speaks of God's anointed one as a suffering servant, as one who willingly takes on our infirmities and who bears our diseases. In the context of this story, it's saying that by drawing close, by embracing those who were excluded, Jesus was not merely making those people normal or more acceptable to society. Rather, he was embracing that he too would now be seen as one of them. Jesus practiced such a solidarity with those marginalized that he willingly accepted the consequences of their stigma upon his own body, upon his own livelihood. And yet, in doing so, we discover the truth that such solidarity doesn't merely end with contracting their impurities, as society says will happen. Rather, this embrace, this solidarity undoes, it overcomes, it conquers the very notion that such people are unclean in the first place. See, Jesus seeks to conquer the marginalizing stigma by embracing it himself. For the power of stigma is maintained through our collective silence and distance, which keeps it and those suffering from it in their place. This he makes clear to the religious leaders of his day and to us. This he makes clear is the pathway to healing our collective body. Wherever scripture or science or medicine or cultural prejudice are used to legitimize exclusion or to justify inequity, the God revealed in Jesus of Nazareth reaches out to embrace, to undo, and to raise to new life. And yes, calls us to go and do likewise. May it be so. For our healing and resurrection. For the healing and resurrection of our church, our community, our world. And let the people say,